Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Computer History from us here at Digilog Collection. I had an episode in the past where we talked about the Atari 800, the Atari 8-bit line of computers, and this time I want to revisit Atari, but this time I want to talk about their 1632-bit machines called the Atari 520 and Atari 1040. But like usual, before we talk about the computer itself, I want to explain a little bit about what's happening around that time. So Atari had great success with the 8-bit line of computers from late 70s to like early 80s to mid 80s, because the Atari 800 and Atari 400, which is a cheaper version, sold quite well. The machines were fairly rugged. They had good specs for the time, both from video and sound point of view, and they were priced fairly competitively. And then later on, around mid-80s, they released the XC and then the XL versions, which were successful as well. But even Atari knew that 8-bit could not be the future, especially since in the beginning of the 1980s, there were microprocessors on the market that could do 16 and some even 32-bit. For example, Intel had the 8088, which IBM started to put inside IBM PC. You also had the Zlog Z80, which was becoming popular. And then later, Motorola came with Motorola 68000, which was a follow-up to the 6800. It was this last processor, the Motorola 68000, that Atari decided to stick their fortunes on. So the new lines of computer was called Atari ST. The ST stands for 1632, which effectively described the way the processor, the 68000 processor, operated inside. It had an external 16-bit data bus, while internally it functions the 32-bit. That was actually not far different from the Intel offerings around 1985, which was the Intel 386SX, which had a 16-bit data bus, but internally functions in 32-bit. Not only that, but the 68000 was gathering more and more followers. For example, it was used by Apple when Steve Jobs decided to use that processor in the new Macintosh line of computers. Really, if you think about it at the time, outside IBM, which decided to stick with the Intel 8088 offering, the Motorola 68000 was gathering more and more steam at the time. So Atari released finally the first in the ST line of computers, the 520 ST, in June 1985, and it was just at the right time because, like I mentioned before, while the Atari 800 were doing well, this was the tail end of their successful time, and Atari needed money. And the first version, like I mentioned, in June 1985 was the 520 ST, followed later by the somewhat more successful 1040 ST. There were actually a lot of variations that Atari produced for the machine, with and without TV modulator, more or less memory for different markets. So let's take a look specifically at the model tree of the computer. Let's talk about all the various models in the Atari 520 ST line. And we'll start with the 512 kilobyte RAM version, of which the original 520 ST is a member of. That was the first released version. That had three versions released later on. First one is the 520 ST-M, with M standing for a built-in modulator for TV output, so you don't have to use the monitor only. Then it was followed by a motherboard redesign, slightly better model called the 520 ST-FM. And finally, we have the 520 STE, which is basically having enhanced sound. It is later on, so we have enhanced sound, larger color palette for 1096 colors, and it used the case for the 1040 line. Then there was the announced but not released 130 ST, which was supposed to be a 128 kilobytes variant, but I guess at that point in time Atari realized that would not be very economical and in demand. Then let's move on to the 1 megabyte RAM versions. The chief of those obviously was the 1040 STF, which is basically the 520 STFM, but with just more memory and a double-sided floppy drive that was inside the case. There were two subversions of this one. First one was the STFM, which basically means it has the built-in TV modulator, and the STE, which is the enhanced version, similar to 520. In fact, it's identical to 520 STE, just that it has 1 megabyte of RAM. And later on, they also released something called Mega STE, which is the same hardware as the 1040 STE, but it had a faster processor. It was running a 16 megahertz. It has a SCSI controller, additional ports, and a different case. Not a bad product overall. Then we have the Mega ST, which it itself had two versions: the 2 megabyte RAM version called the Mega 2, and the 4 megabyte RAM version, obviously as you expected, called Mega 4. Timeline kind of here follows slightly left to the right. The later models were the Mega 2 and Mega 4, and obviously the original one is the 520 ST. But in the lifetime of the Atari line, the 520 and the 1040 appeared alongside each other. They were just basically same models, but instead of having 512 kilobyte of RAM, you had 1 megabyte. The actual launch of the product and the story around is fairly interesting, and you can find more about it in various sources over the internet, such as Wikipedia and fan sites. But what I want to do here is I want to do a hands-on session, so we have a machine model, so just play with it and talk about it a bit more. So let's speak about software and the operating system inside it. At the time of launch, around time of launch, Atari had three really major options regarding what operating system should they ship with the machine. One was basically a port of the then fairly successful Microsoft Windows to the Motorola 68000 architecture. That didn't happen because Microsoft thought they would need around 2 years to produce that, and Atari just did not have that much time before they were running out of money. Number two was, to write their own operating system. That was also a problem because Atari managers did not think that they have the know-how in the house to do that and deliver it in a 6-month period of time that would have been until the machine was actually launched. The final solution, which was actually the one used at the end, was Digital Research GEM, which was basically a port of the at the time popular CP/M operating system to the Motorola 68000 processor. CP/M was around the time starting to be dated. It didn't have a lot of features such as hierarchical file system and so on. DOS was already Microsoft DOS was already ahead of it. So Digital Research was working already on a replacement for CP/M, and Atari approached them. They sent their engineers to work with Digital Research, and then they produced GEM, which was completed just in time for the 520 ST launch in June 1985. Let's talk about the machine itself. What we have here is the Atari 1040 STF. If you remember, I talked about it in the product lineup. This has the power source is incorporated inside, and also contains a double-sided floppy drive to the side. They had to. The back basically is full of ports, such as the monitor, the disc, parallel port, and so on. So are the side here, which has the MIDI in and out, and obviously here, like I mentioned, you have the floppy. So what the engineers did is underneath here, as you can see, that's where the Atari typical trapezoidal mouse and joystick ports are, which is actually quite interesting. The cable goes on, so it's fairly well hidden. Atari shipped with a choice of two monitors at the time. You could have the color monitor, the SE1224, or you could have the monochrome, same resolution monitor, the SM124, that was slightly cheaper at the time. What about peripherals? Well, actually, there were a lot for the time. I mean, you could have modems, such as this one. They could use it for dial-up. You could have, obviously, mice and joystick. And those would be switches you can connect, for example, to a joystick and a mouse. When the system only has two of those ports, obviously all the Atari joystick will still work. This over here is a external hard disk enclosure. We have up to two hard disks, there's only one here. And there were a host of other outside, like such sound peripherals that you could get, because the Atari ST lineup, as you saw on the line, continue up to the 90s. And as such, there were a lot of manufacturers which took advantage of that and produced peripherals. This is the motherboard of the Atari ST computer. To the lower right, we have the main processor, the Motorola 68000. To the left of it is a special processor by Atari, which contains glitter and other bits. Above the microprocessor, we have the Western Digital chip. Above that is the sound chip hidden by the cable. And last but not least is the memory, which can come in configuration of 500 kilobytes, 1 megabyte, 2 or 4 megabytes. Now, we cannot speak about the Atari ST and not mention the MIDI usage. This was one reason why the Atari ST in the mid to late 80s and even in the 90s was fairly popular, is because from the hardware point of view, it had two MIDI ports, one in and one out, and it had good software for sequencing MIDI. A company called C-Lab released initially a software called Creator, and then later on that evolved into something called Notator that was very, very popular at the time with musicians, artists, hobbyists, and so on for interacting with various MIDI instruments and sequencing and producing music. And the other sound capabilities that's worth mentioning of the Atari ST is the Yamaha 2419 chip inside that has 3 square wave voice synthesis and a white noise generator. But all this is no fun if we don't actually get to turn it on and play around with it a little bit. So let's do that. First I'll start the external hard disk. Then I'll start the monitor. And finally, start the computer.